A glass of wine or a pint of beer is how many people like to relax after a long, stressful day. But new research says regularly drinking more than the recommended amount of alcohol could take years off your life. Researchers compared the health and drinking habits of around 600,000 drinkers in 19 countries across the world. They concluded that people shouldn't have more than 5 pints of beer or 5 175 millilitre glasses of wine each week. Drinking more than that was linked to lower life expectancy. Having 10 or more drinks could take 1 to 2 years off your life, while having 18 drinks or more could take 4 to 5 years off. But what do drinkers make of the study?
Things always change, aren't they? 1 minute something's really good for you, another minute something's really bad for you. I think if you're just happy, then just go with the flow.
I do drink a little bit, but you just have to consume it in a moderate, amount. That's it, I think,
It'll just make people think, not another scare story about alcohol or things that we like. So I think probably it'll be totally disregarded.
The British Heart Foundation, which part funded the study, says drinking too much can lead to serious health problems.
We mustn't forget that drinking too much also has an effect on your risk for cancer and other diseases like liver disease. So it's not only your heart health that you need to think about, but it's your overall risk of dying is increased. So the take-home message for people, if you think you're drinking too much at the moment, is you need to start thinking about drinking less.
Since 2016, people in Britain have been advised to have no more than 14 units of alcohol each week, around 6 drinks. The British Heart Foundation says the results are a sobering wake-up call for countries with much higher limits, and warns that many people in the UK drink a lot more than the recommended amount. Charlotte Gallagher, BBC News.
Now for one of my favourite.
If you're having a glass of wine or beer with dinner tonight, a new study suggests it may be good for you. Researchers found women who had up to 1 drink a day and men who averaged up to 2 a day had a lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease. Medical correspondent Dr. John LaPook is with us. John, why is this?
Anthony, there are some theories, okay? Alcohol may cause some thinning of the blood so it can decrease blood clotting within the blood vessels. It also can be an antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and help somehow prevent direct damage to the blood vessels. But in large amounts, alcohol can be toxic to the muscle of the heart.
So what about heavier drinkers, John?
One of the things that was so good about this study is they actually defined what heavy drinking was. I once had a teacher who said, well, a heavy alcohol user is somebody who drinks more than their doctor. That's not helpful. And this actually said a heavy user in women is more than 7 drinks a week, and in men it's more than 14 drinks a week. And in men, that was linked to an increased risk of dying during this study period or getting cancer during that period.
So should doctors be recommending mild or moderate drinking?
Well, the article doesn't say that you should start drinking if you're not already drinking, but it is somewhat reassuring. But you have to remember that there are risks. And for example, there is a slight increased risk of breast cancers. There also can be interactions between alcohol and medications, so you have to speak to your doctor always. And the third thing is, remember that 1 drink can sometimes, in some people, lead to 5 drinks or more. And of course, we all know the ravages that alcohol abuse has led to in our society.
But in general, 1 drink with dinner is okay now, maybe even better than okay. Dr. John LaPook, thanks very much.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I thank you so much for coming to our Food Policy for Breakfast seminar series. And I want to welcome you all to Hunter College here in East Harlem. My name is Charles Platkin, and I'm the director of the New York City Food Policy Center and nutrition professor here at Hunter College. I like those 2 videos because they're significant because they, actually that 1 alcohol study just came out, I think, in the last few days. And being involved with nutrition, I often hear about and are asked, oh, drinking is good for you, correct? Well, I try to not answer. Today's topic is media's role in food and nutrition. And as a journalist and nutrition advocate, I believe this is extremely important. It's an extremely important discussion, one that should be had more often. Today, we are so pleased and honored to have several prominent and impressive guests to discuss how the media influences food choice and consumption and the understanding of it. Today's guests include Diane Charles, food and agriculture correspondent for NPR News, Joe Fassler, features editor for New Food Economy, Sam Fromartz, co-founder and editor-in-chief of Food Environment Reporting Network, and Lauren Wilson, editor of Edible Manhattan and Edible Brooklyn. If they could come up, that would be great. And let's welcome them. I'd like to start by having each panelist, if they would, just introduce themselves and sort of say what you do and your connection to food and journalism. Start with you, Dan.
Right, so I work with NPR based in Washington. There's a little group of us that do food-related reporting. One or two of us, depending how you sort of count, that work mostly for the website and write things for like our food blog, which is called The Salt. And then there are two of us that are more radio-focused. I'm one of the more radio-focused ones. I actually tend to be more on the food production side, agriculture, farming, and my colleague Allison Aubrey, who originally planned to be here today, she does a little bit more of the nutrition side. A little bit of biography. I got into that position a little bit by accident, kind of by way of agriculture and science journalism generally. Grew up on a farm, and along the way when I was writing for a British weekly called The New Scientist, I ended up writing more about sort of farming and genetic engineering of crops and whatnot, and that sort of led me back toward food. And have been with NPR off and on for the past, since 1993, but in my current position since 2011.
Yeah, I'm Joe Fassler. I'm the features editor for New Food Economy, and we are a digital magazine covering the changing politics, economics, and culture of food. We often, get into the debate surrounding food. Like, we don't really just cover nutrition studies often for their face value, but we look sort of at the debate around them and the way they're sort of ingested by the culture. So we're a nonprofit newsroom. We have a staff of, full-time staff, I think of 7 right now, 7 or 8. And we've been around since 2016, and we tend to look at food through the lens of, food as a player in larger stories about our culture and society. So we're often looking at stories through the lens of labor or the environment or economic inequality and the sort of various places that food touches in our lives.
Hi, so I'm Sam Fromartz. I've been a journalist for quite a while, since the late 80s. And I started writing about food, I guess, around 2000, something like that. Did a book on the organic food industry. Since written another book about bread. But I was always a journalist at the same time, and about 7 years ago, when media was imploding, a bunch of us came together to start a nonprofit, which became FERN, the Food and Environment Reporting Network. And essentially what we do is commission freelance writers, as well as some audio producers, to do primarily long-form, in-depth reporting on food topics, and it can range anything. It's food, agriculture, environmental health. So our range of stories really runs the gamut, and they're pretty much out of the news cycle, because we're not competing with daily newspapers. So what we try and do is highly original stories that other places aren't doing, and cover them in a way that sort of raises the profile of the issue or a character. And all of our work is produced with other media outlets. So we co-produce the work, including some of our stuff is on NPR. But we have a wide range of partners.
Did you lose our audio?
Did I lose my? No.
And I'm Lauren Wilson. I'm the editor of Edible Manhattan and Edible Brooklyn. I guess So how did I get into journalism? It's funny I'm sitting here with you, Sam, actually, because I grew up on a farm in North Carolina, and when I was in college, I read your organics book, and it actually inspired my thesis.
There you go.
Yeah, so full circle here today. Anyway, so my background in starting to write about food and agriculture actually came from, I was doing research at the time in Europe on their organics agriculture policy when I was an undergrad, and that turned into writing, like, essentially needing money and seeing that I had probably some articles that could come out of this, and starting to pitch and write freelance around that, and eventually came to New York once I saw a job opening here at Edible, and it worked out. So anyway, I write less these days, but my primary job is editorial. So as far as what Edible Manhattan and Edible Brooklyn covers, I would say that we like to say we are celebratory and educational about New York City, specifically Manhattan and Brooklyn. There are other edibles, as some people in the audience might be aware, in the city, but we can talk about this later. They're different businesses actually, but we do consider them our sister publications. But I would say that any way that we can use food as a lens to talk about and educate about our food system in New York City, we kind of consider that our domain. We're actually working with Fern right now on a story for our upcoming innovation issue, which is exciting, but it runs the gamut. If any of you are Edible readers, you know, from agriculture to dining to anything that might affect what it means to eat and drink in New York City.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, you're also humble. You have such a wonderful, inspiring background. It would take the whole session just to read your bios. So I spared the four of you from that. So, you know, food, agriculture, and nutrition journalism has exploded in the last several years. It's sexy, it catches the attention of readers. Why do you think it's so, all of a sudden, so interesting? Why has food become so sexy to hear about and write about? And is it just a fad, or are we stuck on this? Or what do you think it is?
Michael Pollan?
Yeah. But, you know, it's interesting because when I wrote my book on organics in 2006, I thought the interest in food was peaking then, and I was going to move on to a different topic. And actually, that book was probably too early in a lot of ways compared to what happened later. So that kind of surprised me. But I think it's a number of things. I think, you know, food scares obviously drive a lot of momentary interest in things. But yeah, cultural changes, shifts brought about by people like, you know, Michael Pollan, obviously Mark Bittman's writing, you know, a lot of these writers who had pretty big audiences, and you know, people kept following those issues and following the questions that they were raising.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a golden journalistic opportunity in some ways because food is so universal. We all eat, we all have to. So unlike sports, you know, or you might not care about, or even, you know, even politics obviously affects everyone, but some people don't pay as much attention to that news cycle. Food is just undeniable, the way that we all have to interact with it every day. And at the same time, it's also invisible. You know, there's so much that is not available to us. We can't, you know, visit every farm that we eat food from. It wouldn't be possible. And there's, I think the literacy culturally surrounding food is not all there. I think this interest in looking past, you know, just what's on your plate is a relatively new phenomenon in our current society. So this combination of universality and sort of hiddenness, I think, makes it a really exciting thing to talk about. And I'll just mention that, like, I didn't say how I got into food writing earlier. I was an Omnivore's Dilemma reader in 2007 when it came out. It really opened my mind, and I had this experience from moving from New York to Iowa, where I was doing my graduate work in writing, and suddenly realizing, oh my God, like, I've never seen this landscape before. There's a whole system of food production out here that I know nothing about, and just being plunked down in the middle of that was fascinating to me and completely eye-opening. And a lot of my friends who have never been out to Iowa, who still live in New York, it's a foreign landscape to them completely. So I think one role that food journalists play is we can kind of be a liaison or a tour guide, bringing people to environments and to systems of production that they wouldn't otherwise be able to see.
I mean, related to that too, I think that food is undeniably fun and an easy way to talk to people and just engage with them and connect. Like the amount of people I've been talking about topics where I might lead with something besides food, it's just I think, it's easy for us to want to talk about what we're excited about, what we enjoy, what gives us pleasure, this sort of thing. So I think in terms of growing an audience around food that's not explicitly just interested in the science or maybe something a bit more political or hard, I think that even just being excited and knowing matcha production, if someone's interested in matcha to begin with, that's a gateway if it's something they enjoy consuming. So I think that can contribute. Yeah, we enjoy it.
And Dan, with agriculture, that has not been on the forefront of discussion on the average tongue of a New Yorker, but now it is. We're talking about urban agriculture, hydroponics. I mean, everything is about agriculture, and it's been significantly connected with food, obviously, and scares some of us because it's certainly in an urban environment, agriculture is unknown. Tell us.
Agriculture scares some of you?
It scares me.
Really? Okay. So what your question?
Yeah, just in terms of what are some of the things, why is that becoming, why is big ag on the, in the forefront of our minds these days? In terms of your reporting, what are you discovering? What are you looking at? Are more people paying attention? Those kinds of questions.
Well, certainly people are paying more attention, and I mean, I'm a little bit, when I say Michael Pollan, I'm being a little bit facetious because it's just one guy and a few books, right? But he did really a tremendous thing by sort of connecting people's food experience to agricultural production in a really entertaining, engaging way. And Sam is right, by the way, his book was ahead of its time, and you all should go back and read it because it really sort of tells some of the early history of the organic business before organic became kind of, this battleground, which is what it is today. In covering agriculture, I mean, the interest in agriculture is kind of the popular interest in agriculture is sort of a blessing and a curse. Mostly a blessing, because otherwise I might not have a job. But the curse part of it is it's become sort of this cultural battleground, which just gets in the way often, And so my job, sort of, there's a process of discovery, of sort of visiting places where, sort of food is produced in a sort of basic kind of way, and then interpretation in a way, sort of translating that and trying to communicate some of that to people who are curious. But some subset of them, come at it with sort of very kind of moral judgments, which I tend to sort of push back against. Because I say, look, these are just people out there living their lives doing things that are sort of evolution of a very sort of traditional thing that people have done to earn a living. Driven by economic forces, and you got to understand it first before you start sort of saying, "Oh, how awful" or "Oh, how great." It's not necessarily sort of salvation and hell out there. It's just people trying to make a living.
Thank you. So my first question is, those weren't my first questions. Those were just warm-ups. When the CDC published the results of a study showing that overweight individuals are at no greater risk of premature death than normal-weighted individuals, many Americans were validated and the media went wild. New York Times journalist David Brooks wrote, "A lifetime of irresponsible behavior has been unjustly rewarded." The New York Times eventually modified the story. I have to say that NPR was one of the few that were skeptics about the story. But every other media had reported that it was good to be pudgy And I guess I use that as an example. It happened twice, actually. And it was there were 2 JAMA studies put out by the CDC. And it was misconstrued, and Allison actually, from NPR, interviewed Walter Willett, and it just came up actually last night. I was searching for it, and I was like, oh, Allison did it wrong too, and then I saw that she actually did it right. And I guess my question on it is, what about the responsibility of journalists, whether it be Edible or NPR or the New Food Economy or Fern, what's the responsibility that you take when you're seeing a research study that comes across, and certainly where do you find that? Is it from a press release? And then once you see it, what's your responsibility, knowing what you do know as sort of smart adults that are reporting and working in this field, to discern how it will be perceived by a consumer audience?
I mean, I think the responsibility is to get it right, first and foremost, how to go about it, but how it's, and that being communicated with how it's perceived. I think it's circumstantial. That's a specific case you talked about. I work less in nutrition reporting. I'm not very familiar with what happened there, but I think that depending on whether we're working as writers or editors, we have to go to the source itself and question even the nature of the study. My job as an editor in that way is I would try to connect with a writer who I know that's their specialty if it really felt like something we needed to cover. But I'd be curious to hear what some of the writers have to say.
I mean, I think if you hear a new study, right, that with some dramatic finding and you're considering totally changing your diet around it, I'd suggest you do 2 things first. Is 1, look at the methodology, and 2, look at the funding sources. And it's amazing how often the press will take a dramatic headline and just run with it, sort of at face value. And you can see the temptation to do that, right? Because editors are ink-stained wretches who have no time, just desperate for any new finding that they can put in front of the audience because it gets people to pay attention. And the stakes are instantly high. The problem with that is that often if you look closely at the methodology, you'll see the way this study was conducted, maybe not so conclusive after all. There's often these flaws, or just things, if you really look at the way the study was conducted, there's problems. And part of that is because it's so hard to study diet, right? Are the people self-reporting on what they're eating? How is it being monitored? How do you know they're telling the truth? If it's about alcohol, are they reporting how many drinks they've really had? How do people know that? It's really tricky. And then what other factors are there in their lives? Do they smoke? Do they exercise? How is that being factored in? It's really, really complex to do this. And the other thing is funding sources. I mean, I think part of the reason there's so much confusion around nutrition in the first place is because there's so much money in it. And it absolutely muddies the waters. So I think those are things as journalists we really have to pay attention to and try to not only just look at, but create a conversation around, how is the study of nutrition generally given to certain biases.
Alice and I, at NPR, we are actually within the science desk, and we've been at this a long time, and others around us have too. And we're sort of, the science desk has a reputation of being sort of the grumpy curmudgeons of the news floor, because people are, the shows, like Morning Edition or All Things Considered, they'll see a headline somewhere and they'll always come and say, oh, what about this story? And we're always just dumping on them. That's stupid, that's bogus science, it's they did a sample size of 10, just whatever, self-reported, anyway. So yeah, I mean, a lot of these stories, news organizations treat them as entertainment, right? Drinks, alcohol is good for you, eat up, all that kind of thing. And so I guess there's a place for that in a way, and I think in general the audience has almost come to expect sort of silly nutrition headlines, almost, don't you think? It's almost like a joke.
It's the jadedness in the video.
Yeah, exactly.
They already told us the other thing 2 years ago.
Yeah, like in that second video clip, the host, the the host of the program was coming in with this headline, "A drink is good for you," and then they bring in the poor, like medical expert who kind of plays along, but also sort of contradicts the headline. But then they go back to the headline as the final thing, and the medical expert is has this frozen smile on his face. He was just kind of playing along in a little show. It's kind of sad in a way if you take nutrition seriously.
Yeah, if I can. So I guess the short answer is don't report on one study. You've really got to look at sort of the body of evidence and the body of studies. And the closest experience I had of that is I spent about 6 months looking into the whole issue of gluten sensitivity. And at that time, surveys were showing that something like a third of all people were, at some point, avoiding gluten because they felt, because they'd heard it wasn't good for them. And, if you actually look at the science, and I talked to a lot of scientists and did a lot of research, read a lot of papers, and, obviously there is a small cohort of people who have celiac disease, which are, can be tested. It can be confirmed that they are, that gluten is a health issue for them. What they've also, what these researchers also found is that there is some subset of people that have some gluten sensitivity. It's not clear that it's the same thing. It's not clear how big a cohort that is, and it's not clear what brings that on, which is a really dissatisfying answer for most people. And so you'll see sort of the pro-bread gluten camp says, well, only 1% of people have celiac disease. That's the only people who we should avoid, And then the other camp says, no, there's this whole huge cohort of people who are gluten insensitive. And what I sort of landed on was there is some cohort of gluten insensitivity, but we don't really know much about it, and we don't really know how big it is, which is really dissatisfying. But that's kind of what science is, right? It evolves.
And this becomes a journalistic conundrum, right? And we might talk about this later, but how do you headline that?
Yeah.
Gluten might be okay, it might be bad, really complicated, when everyone else is running, the latest don't eat bread or whatever. It's tough.
Well, it's funny about the gluten because I just had listened to, it's the only thing I got my daughter to listen to was a Freakonomics episode on gluten. And it was very telling because it's funny because as an audience, as a listener or a reader, you try to find things that support what you believe in or what your hypothesis is, right? As an eater. So I think that when I heard the NPR Freakonomics report on gluten, which I suspected there were some issues around.
NPR is not Freakonomics.
No, it's on, but it's sorry, it's local on WNYC, the public radio. I'll take that back. Anyway, on Freakonomics on WNYC, we heard that, and I think that it was what I thought was reasonable reporting. But then now that I'm listening to you, I'm suspect because I wanted to hear what they said. I wanted the conclusion to be what I heard. And I think oftentimes when we're listening and reading to things, we cling on to those that support what our hypothesis might be. What do you think about that?
Sure.
Okay, next question. Going to headlines. So do you write your own headlines? The editors, do your writers write their own headlines? Those that are editors?
Yes, but they don't always run. It's a nice place to start. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like editors have the final say, depending on,
Yeah, we see it as a suggestion that we're completely free to disregard it.
And do you, with headlines, because I think that that's important, because oftentimes that's all that people are reading. Sometimes they're more important. I know that writers would hate to hear this and journalists would hate to hear this, but sometimes they're more significant than the story itself. So can we talk about that for a moment?
So the stories that I do on the radio obviously don't really have headlines, but they do have intros, which serves a little bit the same purpose, and then the version we put on the website. That headline, as a writer, I write one, but it usually gets either revised or replaced. And often, honestly, that is about what will grab people's attention. It's all about audience response. Sort of, will they click on that? Yeah, there are some headlines that give me a little bit of heartburn. Wonder sort of like what impression does that leave in people's minds? Because they are important.
Yeah, I mean, and we work a lot with, as I said, with other partners, so they have their own process of coming up with headlines for the story. Sometimes we use them and sometimes we don't. But generally, I would say at most media companies, headlines are workshopped. In other words, they're passed around like what's going to get the most attention. Is it going to get somebody to click on the article so that they maybe read past the headline, at least to the first paragraph, and then there's a whole process of, especially on websites, of changing headlines based on what's getting the most clicks. So I mean, you'll see that. I mean, that's a process used at like major news sites that the headlines will be changed depending on what's responsive. So the question you're asking though is like, can you take into account those things like having a sexy headline that gets people to click and still be accurate, right? I mean, that's what it comes down to.
Especially when people are headlines.
Right, and so, yeah, you always want accuracy, but you also want people to like read the story. So ideally you have both, and yeah, sometimes the accuracy gets left behind for sure.
But I think actually as a writer, I think if I pay attention, I do have some sort of veto right. If somebody writes a headline that I think is wrong, I'll go to them and say, we can't say that, and they'll change it.
As a science writer, I once wrote an article about yoga and compared to stretching, and the title was, "Is Yoga Fancy Stretching?" And it had a question mark on it, and that was sent out to my syndicated column. Well, and the whole story was very accurate. It was, I thought reasonably balanced. But some of the newspapers had put headlines that were really like, yoga is just fancy stretching, or yoga is nonsense, it's just stretching. So I was getting letters from all over the country from yoga people wanting to, I don't know what to do.
You insulted their spiritual practice.
Right, but the story was not that, but it didn't matter, because none of them had read this story. And it was my first awakening to that concept that the headline matters a lot. What about, well, I guess this is kind of a personal question about, how much feedback do you pay attention to in terms of click-through rates, page views, social media tagging, retweeting, postings, when you write your articles? And do you pay attention to it enough to sort of change how you're looking at information to put back out there, or is it just something that you use as a test of how good your article was, or do you not pay attention to it?
Part of that's necessity. In order to run a publication, you need to, provide stories that readers want to read. So there's that. But as far as, written feedback that's coming in that's trying to critique the article, be in response to it in any sort of way, I mean, I see that as an opportunity for connection and dialogue and continuing the conversation. It's something I don't personally categorically write off for anything we put out there. But yeah, I'm open to it if it seems reasonable too, in that regard. That's how I approach it.
I feel like the click numbers, the page views, the reaction is so unpredictable that it doesn't actually give me much of a guide going forward. I find it very hard to know ahead of time what's going to sort of take off and what won't. And I also resist it because some of the stuff that I put the most time and effort into and care about the most doesn't do very well. So I just refuse to acknowledge that to some extent.
And are you, just out of curiosity, Dan, to that point, because I find this in my own work too, like how often do you find you can plan ahead for a story, and how often are you writing something really reactionary to maybe a conversation that's going on online that you might be able to get more eyes for? Is that ever part of your work?
I think there is, that does now come up when, sort of in conversation with the editor of our blog, who is more in touch with sort of what's going on online and saying, oh, well, we could weigh in on this in a sort of creative, sort of adding something to the discussion. So that does happen, yeah.
But yeah, that's absolutely my experience too. I mean, we can think and think and think about what's going to do well on social media and are continually surprised by what people respond to. There's almost no way to game the system, except for if there is something that's a really big deal that's trending on Twitter, then the algorithms do privilege that, and you can certainly enter the conversation and get a lot more traffic that way. And we do like to try to have our voice be part of that conversation, so it's not totally cynical. But that also doesn't happen all the time in food. I mean, it's not the same as the celebrity beat. It's not the same as the Donald Trump politics beat, where there's constantly, this three-alarm fire. Food news, reporting on food news is really interesting because it can be a really fast news cycle sometimes, and other times, a week will go by with no one dominant story. So it's hard. We have to sort of play a different game. I'm sure you guys find it the same.
Yeah, I mean, we have a full-time engagement editor who basically her role is to increase our presence on social media. So it's hugely important. But yeah, in food topics, they tend to not be trending topics, and our stories, which tend to be kind of offbeat and out of the news cycle, even more so. But that said, you hit these very specialized groups of people. We did a piece on a conflict between commercial and recreational fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico, and I was tweeting it, and all of a sudden all these fishermen and hunting groups were following me, retweeting our story, and the stories we've done on conservation issues have really resonated with those readers. So very different than probably someone in New York.
And how about social listening? How are you using that to inspire stories? I mean, I know Dan, you mentioned that the editor of the blog is sort of discussing some of these issues that are coming up on the blog. So what about social media in terms of, sort of hearing stories first, or have any of you used that to expose something or report on something that you've seen or heard through social media?
Yeah, I mean, I just use it mostly to follow other publications and other reporters that I trust. I mean, getting into the issue of like what news can you trust on Twitter, and so basically I follow other journalists, and you get tips on different stories that way, or see what other people are covering, and we think about how we might, it might raise a question of, well, is that part of a bigger issue or a different issue that's of interest to us? So it becomes a sounding board in a way.
Well, I guess the broader question is, how are you getting your stories mostly? I mean, I guess the impression that some have is that it's a lot through press releases and research studies being released, but that might be sort of a misstep in thinking. How many of your stories, or the majority of them, originated?
This is a sensitive topic for journalists. Personally, I think I might be in a little bit of a different position than my colleagues here on the panel, in that because it is a local publication. I mean, a lot of people sitting in this room who I've talked to today are people who run businesses, that are part of organizations, that are doing interesting research that is here in Manhattan and Brooklyn, the places that I talk about. So just being a part of the community is one way that we find stories, but individual emails, social media, I would consider within the realm of the way I discover stories, and just being aware that a conversation is going on and wondering if we might be able to approach that in a particular way. Personally, that's how I do it. But
It's the question I find I get asked the most, is where do your story ideas come from? And I find it hard to answer, because it's a very sort of chaotic, almost random system for what kind of like bounces to the top of a to-do list. And it is some like combination of, yes, there are, your inbox is flooded with ideas and pitches and sort of agenda-driven press releases. And that does, you basically sort of watch that flow, but very few of them, almost none of them actually directly lead to a story that I do, either on the air or on the blog. There are news events that kind of drive, drive coverage. If something happens that seems to be significant, a government agency does something, like a big sort of scientific study comes out or whatever, that drives some coverage. But the best ones are things that you just sort of happen across that strike you as, sort of an entry point into sort of a bigger thing that's happening in the world that maybe isn't being covered. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there's, like most national publications, we look at local news, we look at trade publications, we look at academic journals, these places that have interesting ideas in them that often are underexposed. But like Dan said, it's often, you think you're following another story, and then somebody says this one thing where you're like, okay, that's the story. And we get bombarded with press releases. Almost none of them, they're all for companies that we would probably never write about. There's this big genre in food journalism of like, so-and-so new tech widget is going to save the world. Like, you've all seen this story. And we get a lot of that stuff. But sometimes a product is, and we try not to do those stories, but sometimes a product is interesting enough that we'll have the conversation, and we don't write the story that, the company wants us to write, but in learning the specifics of what they do, we uncover some larger thing that's exciting that people don't know about, and that's often how it happens.
Yeah, I mean, we get some of our, obviously some of our stories, from scientific journals. They'll not necessarily that will report on a journal study, but it may spark a question like, that's interesting that researcher looked at that. What are the other, what are the other studies around this, or what are people asking about this? And that may lead us down a rabbit hole. Another place is we kind of monitor a lot of local middle of the country media, and so we'll get tipped off, we'll get tip-offs of stories that are happening in places, or because of our writers are really all around the country, they'll see stuff that we wouldn't have noticed, and they'll bring it up to us, and we're like, well, and then start to think about how we can shape that into a national story. And I'll give you one recent example. We saw through a dairy producer network that a warning letter had gone out from a dairy company highlighting that there was a suicide hotline for dairy farmers. And we were like, oh, that's interesting, because we'd been following that, dairy was under pressure and prices were falling. A lot of small farms are under much more pressure, and then you hear that a dairy company is putting out, a tip on a suicide hotline. And we were like, oh, we should look into that story. We didn't move fast enough, and the Times did a story on it about 2 or 3 weeks after we saw that. Although that story is not. They did it in New York State, and it's sort of one aspect of a bigger story that we're still looking into. So that's another point. Just because a story's done, and even if the Times does the story, it doesn't mean that the story's over. So
In terms of thinking about, and I know it's hard to do this, but the story you're most proud of and had the most impact, and the story you're least proud of. I'll start with you, Dan, because you smiled.
Most and least. As a category of story, the stories I'm most proud of are the ones that I feel like, they wouldn't have happened if I wouldn't have done them. But as a specific, so there was a series of stories I decided to do a couple of years ago that was basically just about lives of farm workers. And I sort of constructed this, this frame where basically every couple of months I would take some seasonal food and go to a place where that food is harvested and do a story about the people who were doing the work. And my ground rules were that I would not reach the workers through their employers, which is the usual way that one gets in touch with farm workers often. And I would not use the workers as a way of illuminating some political or controversial issue. Because that's also sort of the common way that these stories are approached. Basically, you have an issue in mind, and then you go find the person that illustrates the issue. And I sort of said, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go find workers, and I ended up reaching them through a network of organizations that provides childcare for migrant workers. Anyway, so in the end, I think I did 5 or 6 of these stories. And it was they were meant as just like portraits of places and workers that are associated with foods that you know. And I liked that series basically because I felt like I was trying to do something that was just a little different. And I'm happy with how they turned out. So that would be on my top. Least favorite, least proud of is probably some story I've completely forgotten, which was, a category of story that you just end up doing when you're part of a major news organization and something happened and we have to cover it because everybody is covering it and you're there and you're part of a crowd. And there's some legitimacy to it because you are providing that same story to your particular audience, but there's no sense of, every story I do, I try to get something in there that reflects, something original to me, but sometimes it's pretty hard, and packed journalism is just the worst, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, like you said, I love it as a journalist anytime I can do something that's somewhat different from what the typical, the standard narrative around something has been. And I don't know if this is a favorite story that I've done, but one recent example of that I enjoyed was I wrote a piece about the Just Scramble, which I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but it's made by the people who do Just Mayo, and it's an egg product, a pourable one, so it works just like egg beaters or something that's made completely out of mung beans. And they claim it's uncannily egg-like. So the stories that were done about this product was we went to the Just Mayo R&D facility and tasted the Just Scramble. Here's what it looks like. Here's how it tasted. Interesting. Gee whiz. And that was cool. But I went there and spent a lot of time talking with these guys and just kind of realizing, okay, here's a company that's taken, I think, $300 million in venture capital. They have a lot of money behind them, and these people expect a serious return on investment. They don't just want to make a fun product that, maybe some vegans can eat. They want to create a plant-based egg that's cheaper to produce than chicken eggs so that everyone in the world uses them. Their ambitions really are that big. So I did do the tasting, and I did talk about the taste and the mouthfeel and all of it, but the piece was really an opportunity to think about, well, what are the implications of this? If we're actually going to be growing eggs on commodity legume farms as opposed to in large intensive chicken production facilities, what's good about that, and what's maybe bad about that, and what questions should we be asking? Because we should have no illusions that this would be a major shift. So I thought there were a lot of interesting conclusions there, too many to go into right now, but it was a fun opportunity to be like, food is about more than just delight. It's about more than just tasting something. It's about more than just the wild power that our technology has now. And hopefully an opportunity to engage readers around the larger ethical and environmental implications of our choices. I think that's a story that actually was never published, but would have been the worst story I ever published, was something that happened really early in the days of New Food Economy, before we even had a magazine we were about to launch, which was in late 2015. I had been writing about a startup called Good Eggs, which you guys might have heard of, I don't know. They sort of were in New York, but failed, which is part of what this story is about. And I'd covered food for The Atlantic and other publications before, but mostly through the lens of public health and sort of policy and labor. And I had never really been a business reporter, and I didn't have those fundamentals, and I'd never spent time around Silicon Valley guys before. So they really did a number on me. I mean, they were really impressive. They had this magic algorithm that like solved everything. They had figured out local food production, and it was gonna work. And I was saved by, so I wrote this very glowing piece, like, it's so cool, I've been to the facility, like, they're shipping out these deliveries everywhere, they work directly with farmers. And our executive editor at the time, Pat Clinton, was like, I don't buy it. Like, this is what, they're lying to you. And I was like, no, like, I talked to this farmer, I met him, it was great. And so he was just like, no, like, this isn't gonna work. And so I was like, okay, fine. I spent all this time on this piece, I was disappointed. Well, a few months after that, they actually failed, and they had this major, like, press release where, like, we're pulling back, we have to rethink everything.
Exist in San Francisco.
Yes.
Yeah.
They failed in Brooklyn, Los Angeles, and New Orleans, and they scaled back just to San Francisco. And this is now years ago. I have no idea what they're up to now. But it was, so instead the piece I actually wrote was like, here's everything that's wrong with this model. And it was an incredibly informative lesson to me, like that you have to go beyond the very compelling sort of sales pitch that some of these well-heeled companies are going to make quite convincingly.
It's hard to choose among your children. So I'll talk about a couple. One that I was particularly proud of, we had a reporter, a really good investigative reporter on the West Coast who was mapping a particularly dangerous class of pesticides, and she was looking at pesticide use data in California and correlating it with zip codes. And she found, the highest zip codes with where these pesticides were used, and then she correlated that with census data, and lo and behold, like the 5 biggest zip codes were above 50% Latino populations. Then she zeroed in on one of them, which was in Oxnard, California, which is in Southern California near the coast. And it turned out a high school was surrounded by strawberry fields where these pesticides were sprayed. And that school, along with a number of others, had been the subject of a lawsuit that had been waged by, had been started by a group of Latino parents. And they had been fighting the EPA for over 15 years in a civil rights complaint. This hadn't really been written about, except in small little news blurbs. So she put her data piece, which took about 6 months of data crunching to come together, along with this pretty rich narrative story about the course of this lawsuit over more than a dozen years. And we had a really terrific story that had an impact. It was also simultaneously a related issue reported on by another news organization, and California started to revamp the regulations over the use of pesticides near schools. So that was, that's kind of like you write a story, has immediate impact, which is great. Most of our stories don't hit that, they just don't hit that level. The other one I'll mention is just a really wonderful story about something you would just never know about and that we never knew about. And it came to us from a reporter in Nebraska who said they're ripping out all these trees in the Midwest, the shelter belts. And I was like, what's a shelter belt? And he said, well, they were planted by, in a program initiated by FDR in the 1930s after the Dust Bowl. And they planted like hundreds of thousands of trees across the Midwest to protect the soil. And now they're being ripped out because farmers want that land to expand corn production. And at the same time, there's sort of projections of climate change and the impact of that and potentially severe droughts coming that precisely what these trees could help prevent in terms of loss of soil. And so it was a really kind of moving story about trees, which is kind of an unusual topic, but it was really a really great story. And so, that's just another that comes to mind. In terms of misses, we can get really wonky sometimes. Food policy, ag policy especially, can get really in the weeds. And sometimes we never get out of the weeds. And we try, but we don't always succeed. So that can be frustrating.
I would agree with a lot with what was said before me, but I think at Edible, so the way we curate our content is one that is generally celebratory, and what we try to tell stories about are things we see happening that are helping increase, a more sustainable, diverse, accessible food system in New York City. And some of the stories I think we've done over time that, on a local level, that have done that. A story we did last year in our innovation issue that was about what is actually it started out as a story that was pitched to me that was like, I'm gonna find like that startup that's doing like that sustainable seafood delivery to everybody's door. Like, here's the easiest way you can get the most sustainable food for New York, or seafood for New Yorkers. And I was like, I don't think that exists to my knowledge, like based on what I had seen through press releases and what had been written on a national level and other places. So I went back to the writer and I said to her, like, what if the question is, like, what is the most sustainable seafood for New Yorkers to eat and where can you get it? Just like a very, like, hopefully tangible piece. And she did a fantastic job with it, and turned out, yes, there is no startup who's actually doing this. You have to, like, go actually to the Union Square Green Market. Is the best one. We could talk about what it is. I can share the story, but anytime we can do something like that or help report like with the Department of Sanitation how municipal composting is being rolled out and what can actually be used in that, how are used in that system, how waste streams can be managed better. The effects of how the Department of Sanitation is managing the waste. What does that mean for the local environment of New York City? That's within our realm. How urban agriculture is changing in New York City. And this is actually related to the story we're working on with Sam and Fern, but with the emergence of different startups that are doing indoor ag, and there has been a policy response to this in New York, although that's still kind of changing and evolving. As this policy develops, as these companies grow, who's being served, who's benefiting, what does that landscape look like? So those are the stories I'm proudest of when we can actually hit the mark there, and I think make something that it feels really tangible to the people who live here. The ones I'm least proud of, I guess, I don't know, as an editor, I'm not proud when I feel like I can't give enough attention to a writer, and as much as I would like. And when a story, like the worst ever is when I have to offer a kill fee. That just kills me, actually. It unfortunately doesn't happen that often. But yeah, in a certain sense, the ones, I don't know, my attention all too often I feel like is trying to tell to find a good story to tell, that the other ones that don't work out all too often kind of I do forget in that way. I try not to focus on them too, because that is a negative way of thinking on the day-to-day. But yeah.
That was great. So my last personal question, then we'll go to the audience, or maybe two questions. Training. It almost seems like if you're reporting on food, because it's so important, that you should have to have a license. What do you think about training and the lack thereof of people that are reporting on food throughout the country and the world. And there's a high level of responsibility because people eat every day, and they do listen to journalists, social media, and to get their kind of nod what to do. Any thoughts on that?
We work with some younger journalists, but it takes a lot of time and sort of hand-holding to train them. But it's like anything, I mean, if you're in food service, you got to start washing dishes, I mean, so there's always a place to start, and it's the same with journalism, and it's usually with a shorter piece, and just trying to get that right. We're actually working with a journalism student who pitched us, and she's at Columbia, and her story, I think, has gone through 5 or 6 drafts, and it's like a pretty short story, like 500 or 600 words.
What do you think the biggest misses are in terms of young journalists, and also in terms of social media, sort of being, not non-curated reporting that's going on?
Well, I mean, in social media, it's like, can you trust what you're reading? That's a big one. In this particular case, it's like, what is the audience you're writing for? It was a local issue. How do you sort of raise it to a bigger than people in Brooklyn would be interested in? Because our readers are not in Brooklyn. So that's kind of, there's certain techniques to do that, certain questions you need to ask that she wasn't asking. So.
There are so many different things that come together. There's experience with the thing that you're reporting about a little bit. So subject expertise, and particularly sort of, if you're talking about science, ability to sort of understand a little bit sort of the scientific context of a scientific study you might be looking at. And then there's the craft part of like putting yourself in the mind of your audience and communicating, sort of figuring out what actually sort of bridges this gap between the story I'm trying to tell and the mind of the reader or the listener that allows you to communicate. It's a sort of a complicated sort of set of experiences, and then along with that, the ability to kind of be almost self-critical. It's like a journalist gets himself or herself in trouble most quickly when you feel like you know who the good people are in this story and sort of take their point of view and are blind to another point of view. It's almost like the stories that, sometimes the stories that you feel like you're doing God's work are the ones that get you in the biggest trouble.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think, one big genre of contemporary food writing is just the sort of, food porn focused on delight and consumption. But the other big genre really is kind of the pull back the veil genre. And this has a long history, right, with The Jungle and forward. And I think that's what a lot of people think of. And we see this all the time with freelancers, where they come into a story and they really think they know who the villain is, or they really think they know who the hero is. And most of the time they're wrong. And it's hard to actually convince them of that sometimes, and it's hard to convince them even that that's not the way that they should be thinking about the story even. And I tend to agree that the best stories are, you come into it thinking you've got it all figured out, and you know who the good guy is, and then you as the writer, as you continue to uncover, realize that it's more complicated than that. And when you have that kind of a personal evolution, I think it's a sign that it's a good story. I think a challenge that's sort of the flip side of like not covering food enough to have empathy for the various sides of an equation. We often do feel like we're in the weeds, like we do this all the time. Our level of knowledge about food policy and about the food system far surpasses, you know, the average Americans. And that's a challenge. Like a lot of the time we have a story where it's like, okay, here's this major policy shift regarding animal welfare that people don't know about in the first place. So like, how do we convince them that something important is changing when they were not even aware of the status quo? So we try to make every article that we publish be something that's accessible to someone who's never really read about food before. And that's very important to our editorial mission, but it's a real challenge, and it's an ongoing one.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, bias is very difficult when you're trying to, when you do have a message, but you're trying to do, you know, journalism and give someone a balanced view. I always think it's complicated. And also competing with non-curated content, with the citizen journalist and what their biases might be and who's listening. So I think all those things seem to be very complicated. I'm going to open it up to some questions, but I wanted to read this. I'm not asking you to respond, but just things I wrote down that I was surprised you didn't corner me in the. I wasn't never going to ask this of you, but butter or not, plant-based versus organic versus paleo, vitamin supplements, yes or no, organic or not, GMO or no, and are veggies a silver bullet? Just some headlines that I wrote down that I thought, wow.
Did you mean to set the stage for my question? Because you did. All of the topics, hi, Chris Sarpadoulis, Health Literacy and Science Literacy. All the topics you just raised, topics we write about. My question is, over the last 30, 40 years, we've been studying public understanding of science here and in Europe, right? I mean, all the NSF data is in. We know that less than 20% of the population here and in Europe is science literate, knows anything about the scientific method, knows anything about the below layer of any of these topics. Your story in Tulsa, your great story about civil society, the story about Philadelphia. Okay, so I study how the local, small regional papers, La Semana and all the others talk about the issues. And then what happens when we universalize them in the media, in our media? And not only are they written at a science literacy level, inaccessible to the vast majority of people in this country, they're also written at a fundamental literacy level. I have analyzed all the literacy levels of your productions. Try as you can, they're fabulously written. They're written at 15th to 17th grade level, and 50% of the population is reading at 5th grade level and lower. So my question is, and I ask this honestly, and I ask this as a writer, not just a researcher. Since we've identified this gap for at least 30 years, how do you see any hope in closing the gap and therefore opening your readership to compete more rigorously? Because we cannot get to the accurate story if only less than 20% of the public can read it. The junk stories and the junk science will win out because they're written so much more accessibly. So my question is, how do we get there? I mean, I'm at the end of my career. I haven't gotten there. Don't do that.
I mean, I think.
Don't do that to me.
Don't do what? I think, frankly, that people who are reading at that below 5th grade level are probably getting their news from television, right? That's where they're.
They're not watching TV anymore.
So what are they
They're
doing?
surfing the web just like you and me, and they're on their phone. See, that's our bias, that we can't do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I just, it's, you know.
Do you think about health literacy when you're writing your stories?
Or science literacy or fundamental.
Well, since we do all of our work in concert with other publications, it's really trying to reach that publication's audience. So there is an audience bias there already, you know, in terms of the partners we're working with.
One last question.
Is anybody else on it?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm not quite sure how to respond because, okay, so we, you know, our audience, do we have a choice in the matter? I mean, you're almost saying, I mean, these media enterprises, they're built to some extent as sort of economic enterprises. You can sort of shape how you present things and hope to attract an audience. You can, I think the way NPR evolved, they created a news, sort of an audio news stream that was, because it emerged out of college radio, it was sort of aimed at a relatively educated general interest audience. You know, we now have that audience. It's expanded a lot in recent years. I'm not, I mean, the real focus, you know, as an institution is expanding our audience racially, to some extent geographically. I don't think that there's a huge amount of focus on sort of expanding it, you know, in terms of, you know, reaching people who are reading at a whatever, you know, what are you saying the reading level is of the target audience that we?
Half the population in the United States is reading at 5th to 7th grade and lower.
Yeah. We would be choosing a different audience if we changed our content. And we are the captive to the audience we have, essentially. I'm saying we can't do it, basically.
I would also add into this mix, I don't know if this directly answers your question or not, but I think more and more so, like, we're also beholden to how people come across our content to begin with. So if they're on their phones on social media, however those algorithms work to cater their particular feed or what's being, they're stumbling across that way. I mean, it's not just like, you know, we write a story, it's about them, like it's got to go through channels for it to be found and discovered in that way. So I think that's important to consider too.
All right, we got one more quick question.
Okay, quick question. Going back to the gluten issue and gluten sensitivity. When I was in Terra Madre a couple of years ago, there was a panel discussion talking about the production of wheat and that most wheat was grown in Sicily. They were the largest producers of wheat. And now Canada is the largest producers of wheat. And the question was, how can they be growing so much wheat in Canada when it's the climate that they needed of Sicily? They can't even grow wheat north of Rome, they were saying, in Italy. And the way that they're doing it is because when they harvest the wheat, they spray it with Roundup. So my question is the sensitivity that's really happening with everybody with wheat, is it really sensitivity to the residue of the Roundup that's on the wheat? Because they harvest the wheat and then they spray it with the Roundup to make it dry quicker. So my question is there going to be an article sometime soon, or has there been, to really look at that issue as to whether the sensitivity that everyone has, if you correlate the timing from when they started producing the wheat this way to when the food allergies started really taking off and becoming so popular. You know, I'd like to see writing about that correlation. Thank you. I'm Bhavani Jara from IE Green. Thanks.
I mean, you're unpacking a lot in there because, so wheats obviously originally came from the Fertile Crescent. That's where the wild wheat was originated, and you know, it's been adapted to many different climates. And yes, it can't grow like in the very far north, which is where rye tends to predominate. But it can be adapted to a wide range of climates. And it has been adapted to those climates. I mean, wheat has been grown in Canada since, I think, around the 1850s. And Roundup is a relatively recent development. I mean, Roundup, Dan wrote a book on this stuff. I mean, Roundup was you know, developed in what, the last 3 decades or so?
Longer actually.
Right. So you know, people were eating wheat from Canada long before Roundup appeared on the scene. There was one article in kind of a not well regarded journal that by a a computer scientist that was making a connection between Roundup and gluten issues that was pretty widely discredited. Roundup is now the subject of lawsuits regarding cancer, based on different opinions of different scientific bodies. But generally, I have not seen that particular strand of thought followed up. But I will say, and this gets back to, how information is spread, that is, like in the internet, that is a pretty widely shared kind of meme, which is Roundup causes gluten insensitivity. You'll see that a lot, but if you actually try and support it with scientific evidence, I haven't found much behind it.
It's interesting because, I mean, this wades into a lot of the issues we've been talking about today. Like, anytime we cover anything having to do with GMOs, it tends to be explosive and people have a lot of opinions, pro and con. I think a lot of people, they don't even realize that they're so freaked out about the modification of the crop itself. The whole next layer of the conversation is, a lot of crops are modified so that you can use specific pesticides or herbicides on them. And I think that often isn't even part of the conversation, right? The layer beyond that is like, what are the sort of economic implications of this, chemical intensive, input intensive, highly privatized and mechanized model? We rarely even get there. So it's just interesting. Another thing is like, bringing it back to nutrition. How do you even study? How do you study the impact of trace chemical ingestion on a body over the course of a lifetime? I don't know if you can. I mean, in a way that, like, I literally don't know how you would study it. And so there is a huge gap, I think, in the research, because it's not necessarily the kind of thing you can study. And so I think in the absence of that, there's all kinds of opinions and things that come in and a lot of uncertainty. So that is, hopefully where we step in to do our jobs. But in this particular case, yeah, I don't know.
Well, thank you all. I do want to try to stick to our time. Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. Dan, Joe, Sam, and Lauren.